I was 17 the night my father decided to teach me a lesson by burning everything I owned in a steel barrel in our backyard. And the worst part wasn't the fire, it was how calm he was while it happened, like he was tending to yard work instead of erasing my life. He stood there with a garden hose in one hand, not to save my things, but to protect his precious lawn, while my clothes, my sketchbooks, and the only thing that had ever made me feel loved, my grandmother's handmade quilt, curled into ash in under 4 minutes. And I remember thinking in that moment that something inside me had gone quiet. Not broken exactly, just done speaking, done asking, done hoping he might someday see me as something more than a problem to control. My name is Bethany. I'm 23 now, and 6 years after that night, I called him for the first time since I left, said 2 words, and what he found in his mailbox later that evening changed everything, though not in the way he would have expected. But to understand that moment, you need to understand the house I grew up in, a 3-bedroom ranch on Ridgewood Drive that my father treated like a kingdom he built with his own hands, where every rule was his and every breath we took felt like it needed his permission. Dinner was always at 6, I cooked, I cleaned, my older brother ate and walked away, and my father sat at the head of the table with the TV remote, like a judge deciding what the rest of us were allowed to experience. And if anything wasn't exactly how he wanted it, the silence would thicken until it felt like punishment. He controlled everything, even my documents, locking my birth certificate and social security card in a cabinet I wasn't allowed to access, while my part-time job money went into a joint account I couldn't touch. So even the hours I worked didn't belong to me. And when I dared to dream about college, quietly filling out an application at the school library, clearing my browser history like I was committing a crime, he found out through monitoring software he'd forced the school to install after I once reported him to a counselor at 14, a decision that turned me into the family's scapegoat for years. When he confronted me that night, his voice was low and controlled, which was worse than yelling. And when I admitted I'd applied, he didn't argue or lecture. He simply stood up, grabbed a trash bag, and told me to go outside. And within minutes, my room was stripped bare, my belongings reduced to garbage, and then to fuel. And when I begged him not to burn the quilt, my grandmother's last gift, stitched over 3 winters with scraps of fabric that held memories, he looked at me like I'd missed the point entirely and dropped it into the flames anyway. And as it burned, he raised his voice just enough for the neighbors to hear, declaring, "This is what happens when you disobey me," as if I were an example, not his daughter. That night, I lay on a bare mattress, staring at the ceiling, until my mother slipped into my room in the dark and pressed an envelope into my hand. My documents, $340 she'd secretly saved, and a whispered instruction to leave and never come back. And 15 minutes later, I climbed out my window and walked away from everything I'd ever known, not toward a plan, but toward survival. I spent the next months in a youth shelter, working nights at a gas station, studying for my GED, learning how to exist without asking permission, and every step forward felt impossibly small and impossibly hard, but it was mine. And over time, those steps added up to community college, to a degree, to a job at a title company where I learned the language of property and ownership, the quiet power of paperwork, the fact that a deed could mean more than any declaration shouted across a backyard. By 22, I had my real estate license, a steady income, and something I'd never had before, control over my own life. And I wasn't looking back until one day a familiar address appeared on a foreclosure list at work, 4892 Ridgewood Drive, my father's house, the one he'd built his identity around, now slipping out of his hands because of loans he'd taken to fund my brother's failed business. Debts piled on debts until the bank stepped in where pride refused to bend. I could have ignored it, told myself it wasn't my problem, but the truth is I ran the numbers like I would for any investment and realized it made sense. And maybe that's what mattered most, that this wasn't just emotional, it was practical, logical, earned. And a few weeks later, I stood in a courthouse auction room, raised my paddle, and bought the house for $131,000 with money I'd worked years to save. And when the deed was recorded in my name, I didn't celebrate. I just sat in my car holding the paper, feeling the weight of it settle into something real, something undeniable. And then I drove back to that street for the first time in 6 years, took a photo of myself standing in front of the house, wrote "new owner" on the back, and placed it in the mailbox. The next day, I called him, and when he answered on the first ring, I simply said, "Check your mailbox," and hung up, because there was nothing else to say. I wasn't there when he opened it, but I was told he stood very still, then sat on the porch steps for 40 minutes, holding the photograph like it might explain something it couldn't. And when he came to my office days later, angry and demanding, insisting I'd taken what was his, I told him the truth plainly, that he had lost it long before I ever stepped in, that the bank didn't care about his pride or his rules, and that actions have consequences, whether you believe in them or not. I gave him 30 days to leave, no more, no less. And when he finally moved out, I returned to the house with a contractor and began rebuilding it. Not just the structure, but the meaning of it. New paint, new roof, new floors. And in the back room, the one that had once been mine, I found a small box hidden on a shelf containing charred remnants of my past, including a single square from my grandmother's quilt, which meant that at some point after the fire, my father had reached into the ashes and saved something, though he never told me, never apologized, never used it to make things right. And I realized then that regret doesn't always look like change. Sometimes it just sits quietly, doing nothing. I framed that piece of fabric and hung it on the wall, not as forgiveness, but as truth, something that existed whether he acknowledged it or not. And I let my mother stay in the house, gave her a lease instead of charity, because dignity mattered more than anything else we could rebuild. Months later, when my father called again, there was no yelling, no commands, just a tired voice asking about my mother, and I told her she was safe, and that I wasn't going to pretend the past didn't happen, but I also wasn't going to carry it forever, and that was the closest we came to understanding. Now, when I sit on the porch in the early morning, coffee in hand, watching sunlight hit the same brass house numbers he used to polish, I don't feel like I won something from him. I feel like I built something for myself, from nothing, from ash, from a moment when I had every reason to disappear and instead chose to keep going. And if there's anything worth taking from my story, it's this. No one is coming to carry you out of the fire, but that doesn't mean you can't walk out on your own, one step at a time, until one day you look back and realize the life you built is stronger than anything they tried to burn.